The Supreme Court is a very influential institution in America. Despite the fact that the Supreme Court consists of 9 unelected judges, it has always been influential in American history and has shaped American culture and life. These judges are known as justices, and there have been numerous justices throughout American history. I will be ranking the 9 greatest Supreme Court justices in my opinion. Why 9, you ask? Well, because there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. There have been attempts to increase the size of the Supreme Court, and previously there were 6 justices instead of 9. However, we're going to be ranking the top 9 justices in my opinion. So, moving on, I will be ranking judges based off of their consistency and whether or not they tried to cut corners politically. I, generally speaking, like justices who did not have any sort of political agenda and just interpreted the law plainly. I also like justices who were, generally speaking, more reserved and favored judicial restraint or the idea that the courts should be interpreting laws, not making laws. I also am willing to allow justices on this list who have overruled precedent because of the fact that, generally speaking, let's just say the precedent sucked, and it was genuinely speaking a step in the right direction for America. In this list, I'll try to include both liberal and conservative justices, and I'll try to make a well-rounded, balanced list, and I'll also like justices who have been good writers throughout the court's history. So, with that out of the way, let's get started. Number 9 is Justice Robert Jackson. Robert Jackson has had a reputation as the court's greatest writer in its entire history, which is really saying something considering the fact that the court has had a number of phenomenal writers. Justice Jackson dissented during the Supreme Court case Korematsu versus United States. Korematsu versus United States was arguably the worst case in the court's history, and the fact that Justice Jackson dissented in this case is in and of itself a good thing. But Jackson's opinion in this case was incredibly well written and is still today cited by legal scholars. His majority opinion in the case West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett was also incredibly well written, and his opinion was, generally speaking, a very good opinion where he forcefully defended free speech and the freedom of expression. An excerpt from that decision is: the very purpose of a Bill of Rights was to withdraw certain subjects from the vicissitudes of political controversy, to place them beyond the reach of majorities and officials, and to establish them as legal principles to be applied by the courts. One is right to life, liberty, and property, to free speech, free press, freedom of worship and assembly, and other fundamental rights may not be submitted to vote. They depend on the outcome of no elections. Justice Jackson also, generally speaking, supported a more restrained president of the United States, as we can see with the Supreme Court case Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer, where he ruled that the President of the United States did not have the authority to seize private property. This was a good ruling, and his majority opinion was also, he joined on to the majority opinion written by Justice Hugo Black, and his concurring opinion was even more well written than the majority opinion. An interesting thing about Justice Jackson was that he did not possess a law degree, despite the fact that he was arguably one of the most knowledgeable justices on the court. Number 8 is Justice Charles Evan Hughes. Charles Evan Hughes was, generally speaking, a moderate member of the court. He had favored judicial restraint and believed that the courts should not be making the laws, that they should, generally speaking, uphold precedent. Justice Hughes, generally speaking, he upheld Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, and in a few cases he did overrule Roosevelt's New Deal acts, but generally speaking he upheld them. He was a great leader on the court and was generally a moderate. He sometimes sided with the conservatives and he sometimes sided with the moderates. He's also well known for being a presidential candidate in the 1916 election, and he had served on the court previously from 1910 to 1916 before he was Chief Justice, but generally speaking, his service as Chief Justice is better remembered. Number 7, we have Joseph Story. Joseph Story's most important case where he was on was the Supreme Court case Martin versus Hunter's lease, where he asserted the power of the Supreme Court and stated that the Supreme Court had supreme authority over all state courts and other courts. He also was an opponent of slavery and believed that, and you can see this in the Supreme Court case United States versus the Amistad, where he wrote the majority opinion and argued against slavery. He also was a firm believer in property rights against the federal government. It's argued that Joseph Story had shaped the law more than any other Supreme Court justice. Number 6, we have Antonin Scalia. This may be a controversial one given the fact that he just recently passed away, but Scalia is without a doubt one of the most influential justices in the Supreme Court's history. Everyone has to say that, whether they're a moderate, a liberal, or a conservative. Justice Scalia is undoubtedly one of the most influential justices in the court's history. Sure, Justice Scalia was a firm believer in originalism, but he was consistent with his beliefs, and he never tried to cut corners politically, and he never had any sort of political agenda. You can see this with the Supreme Court case Texas versus Johnson, where he believed that flag burning was constitutional and was allowed because it was free speech. Justice Scalia is also arguably the most passionate justice the court has ever had in its entire history, which is really saying something, and his majority opinion, and his opinions, whether being in the majority or being in the dissent, have always been well written. Number 5, we have John Marshall Harlan. John Marshall Harlan was a firm believer in civil rights and believed in the constitutionality of the 14th, 15th Amendments, also known as the Reconstruction Amendments, and he was the only dissenter in the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson, which is honestly sort of surprising considering the fact that he was from the South and he used to be a slave owner. John Marshall Harlan was also a firm believer in the rights of the disadvantaged and people who were economically struggling, and he was a believer. He also was willing to uphold antitrust laws while the rest of the court was striking them down, and also supported the constitutionality of a federal income tax. His dissents he was often in the dissent and was known as the Great Dissenter because many of his opinions were dissenting opinions. However, his dissenting opinions became the framework for the Warren Court, which was very influential. Number 4, we have Earl Warren. Speaking of the Warren Court, here's Earl Warren, the Chief Justice who presided over the Warren Court. Yes, Earl Warren was a judicial activist. There's no denying that. He did go too far in many of the rulings and did shape America in a way where it was sort of as if he was making laws instead of interpreting laws. That is true. However, many of the cases under the Warren Court have in fact helped America in a positive way and were in fact the right decision, such as Gideon versus Wainwright, where he asserted that the defendant has to have a right to a lawyer, or Brown versus Board of Education, where he overruled Plessy versus Ferguson and forced schools to desegregate. Those were good things. Also, Loving versus Virginia, where he basically ruled anti-miscegenation laws as unconstitutional. We also have the case where Reynolds versus Sims, where he forced states to make fair legislative maps that did not discriminate against voters. Overall, Earl Warren, he also made sure that all of these cases were unanimous and had the support of everyone on the court, whether they were liberal or conservative. These were good things. Number 3, we have Oliver Wendell Holmes. Oliver Wendell Holmes was a believer in judicial restraint, and like I said earlier, the idea that the court should be interpreting, not making laws. He upheld numerous antitrust laws, and was a firm believer in freedom of speech. However, he did support some limits on free speech, such as in the United States case Schenck versus United States, where he stated that a man who was distributing anti-draft newspapers was guilty because of the fact that it's not free speech if you're hurting someone, which was in that memorable quote, "A free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic," also known as shouting fire in a crowded theater. This is known as the clear and present danger test when it comes to freedom of speech. Charles Evans, the main reason why I'm including Oliver Wendell Hughes is because of how good of a writer he was. He was one of the greatest writers in the court's history, along with Robert Jackson. I would argue he and Jackson are the two greatest writers in the court's history. Many of his opinions were in fact dissents, and they were short, but still well written and much more memorable than the long, lengthy 20-page opinions that we mostly know of. Number 2, we have Hugo Black. Hugo Black was a firm believer in textualism and originalism. He often rotated between the two when it came down to his ideas, and he also was a firm believer in the Bill of Rights. He supported a wall between the church and state. He also was a supporter of the Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education. He voted to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, which was generally speaking pretty surprising considering the fact that he used to be a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and he had in fact filibustered an anti-lynching bill under the Roosevelt administration. However, at the end of the day, he had truly had a change of heart. He also wrote the majority opinion in Gideon versus Wainwright, where he argued that anyone has to have a right to a lawyer, and if they don't have the means to afford a lawyer, then the state has to provide a lawyer for them. Sure, these are generally speaking liberal cases. However, Hugo Black was not entirely liberal. He also held some conservative views, such as his belief in originalism, textualism, and judicial restraint. He also was one of the dissenters in the Supreme Court case Griswold versus Connecticut, and he was against the idea of substantiative due process, whether used in a liberal or conservative way. Hugo Black was not entirely perfect, though, as shown in when he authored the majority opinion in the Supreme Court case Korematsu versus United States. This was, without a doubt, his biggest mistake during his time on the Supreme Court, but nonetheless, I would say that his better cases outweigh this one. Number 1 is John Marshall. John Marshall is, without a doubt, the most influential Supreme Court justice in the history of the court. We see this with the Supreme Court case Marbury versus Madison, which basically transformed the court and gave it the power of judicial review. Also, numerous times he had asserted federal supremacy over the states through the cases McCullough versus Maryland and Gibbons versus Ogden. He also did support Native American rights to lands in Georgia during that case. I think it was, let me see here. He had supported the Native American rights to land in that Supreme Court case Worcester versus Georgia, where he stated that Georgia law, which prohibited non-Native Americans from being present on Native American lands without a license, was unconstitutional. Despite this ruling in favor of Native Americans, Andrew Jackson, he had ignored it and still proceeded to remove Native Americans from their ancestral lands. Nonetheless, though, John Marshall is undoubtedly the greatest justice in the Supreme Court's history. He has had the most impact and is pretty much the reason why the court is so powerful today. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Happy 4th of July, everyone. Make sure to like this video down below and subscribe to the channel.